Mexico's turning point, the end of an era for American dairy. A quiet shift is occurring in North America's dairy industry, one that signals the fading dominance of the United States and the surprising rise of Canada. Just a few years ago, the U.S. stood as the dairy heart of the continent, its milk a staple in the homes of millions across North America and beyond. But today, the situation has changed dramatically, and Mexico, once the largest importer of American dairy, is increasingly turning its back on its longtime partner. So, what's going on? In 2023, Mexico accounted for more than 20% of U.S. dairy exports, making it the largest destination for American milk. A solid figure, one that seemed unshakable. Yet, over the past few years, a transformation has been quietly unfolding. The milk that once defined a continent's food supply is now at risk of being dumped as waste, and Canada has quietly stepped into the void left by the U.S.'s changing market position. What caused this shift? Why is Mexico turning to Canada? And how did the U.S. lose its once unassailable grip on the dairy market? The rise of the U.S. dairy industry came after World War II when American milk was marketed as a symbol of abundance and civilization. The U.S. was the world's dairy supplier, its milk shipped across the globe, from Europe to Africa, often with the words "Made in the USA" on every can of butter or powdered milk. By the 1990s, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, further solidified the U.S.'s position as the leading dairy supplier in the region, with the U.S., Canada, and Mexico forming a powerful trade partnership that would dominate the dairy market for decades. However, as Mexico's consumer base began to evolve, so did their priorities. For decades, Mexico depended heavily on American milk, due to its proximity and the reliability of its supply. But in recent years, the younger generation of consumers has started to question the ethics of food production, and with it, the origins of their milk. This shift is not just about price, it's about values, about where the food comes from and how it's produced. While U.S. dairy farmers, particularly those in California, Wisconsin, and Idaho, rushed to scale production and maximize output, they did so at the expense of something more intangible: trust. Large industrial dairy farms with automated milking systems, high-pressure sterilization processes, and genetically modified feed offered cheaper milk. But in doing so, they raised questions about the origins of their products. The sheer scale of production began to overshadow the quality concerns, questions about hormone use, cattle feed, and animal welfare. In contrast, Canada took a different approach. The Canadian dairy system embraced a slower, more controlled pace. Milk prices in Canada are higher, but they reflect a well-regulated system that ensures the cows are treated ethically and fed a fully plant-based diet. Consumers came to trust Canadian milk not just for its quality, but because it embodied values of sustainability, ethical farming, and transparency in the production process. Mexico, once loyal to U.S. dairy, began to look across the border to Canada. What they found was a partner who may not have been the cheapest, but who offered a product grounded in a different set of values. Canada's dairy industry, although smaller and slower in its approach, seemed to offer what Mexico was now seeking: trust, transparency, and sustainability. This change was not a sudden shift, but rather a gradual transition. In 2023, U.S. dairy exports to Mexico were down by 9%, marking the sharpest drop since 2017. Meanwhile, Canadian exports to Mexico surged by 31%. While the U.S. remained confident in the scale of its dairy production, Mexico's consumer base was no longer willing to turn a blind eye to issues surrounding the ethics of production. The message was clear. Milk wasn't just about the price or volume, it was about the story behind it. Canada's quiet victory, building trust and telling a better story. As the U.S. dairy industry faced significant setbacks in its largest foreign market, Canada quietly began to secure its place as the preferred supplier for Mexico's evolving consumer base. The turning point came in the form of a multi-billion-dollar dairy export deal signed between Canada and Mexico, an agreement that would shift the dynamics of the North American dairy market for years to come. Unlike the U.S., which had rushed to industrialize its dairy sector, Canada had taken a more deliberate approach. The Canadian dairy industry, while producing less, focused on producing high-quality milk that could be traced from pasture to table, a model that gained significant traction with consumers who were beginning to demand more ethical and sustainable practices in their food. The story of Canadian dairy is one rooted in transparency, ethical farming practices, and environmental sustainability. It's not just about the milk itself, but the journey it takes, from the cow to the consumer. This approach has paid off in dramatic ways. In the first quarter of 2025, Canadian dairy exports to Mexico increased by 31%, a staggering figure that marked a significant shift in market preferences. By contrast, U.S. dairy exports to Mexico had dropped by 9%, signaling that American milk was no longer meeting the evolving demands of the Mexican market. The shift wasn't about price, it was about trust. While U.S. milk was cheap, it came with questions. What were the cows fed? Were growth hormones used? Were they living in cramped, factory-style farms? The story behind American milk was increasingly becoming a liability, while Canada's story, slow, deliberate, ethical, was gaining ground. In the eyes of Mexico's new generation of consumers, Canada's dairy was not just about quality but also about trust. In a world where the provenance of food matters more than ever, Canada's milk was seen as cleaner, more ethical, and far more transparent than its U.S. counterpart. Mexico's shift toward Canadian dairy was not merely an economic decision but a cultural one, a reflection of a society that was increasingly focused on the ethics of food production. Consumers wanted to know more than just the price tag. They wanted to understand where their food came from and how it was produced. The Canadian government, in partnership with the dairy industry, had spent years building a brand based on these values. While Canadian milk might cost 15% more per gallon than American milk, it sold because consumers knew that every dollar was going towards supporting sustainable farming practices, ethical treatment of animals, and environmental stewardship. This, in essence, was Canada's trump card. It wasn't just about the milk, it was about the values behind it. But Canada's rise as a leader in ethical dairy production wasn't without its challenges. Mexico's embrace of Canadian milk also meant that small dairy farms in the U.S. were left behind. For many small-scale American farmers, the shift toward industrialized farming had already caused significant hardship. In Wisconsin, a farmer watched helplessly as 8,000 gallons of milk were dumped simply because there was no market for it. Elsewhere in Iowa, farmers were receiving calls informing them that Mexico had canceled their contracts in favor of Canadian suppliers. These were not isolated incidents. According to Farm and Dairy, over 6,000 small dairy farms in the U.S. have closed in the past 3 years, a staggering loss that reflects a broader issue with the U.S. dairy system. The problem with American dairy farming is not just about price, but about a lack of support for small farmers. In the U.S., dairy prices fluctuate based on global demand, leaving farmers vulnerable to market swings. When prices drop, they bear the brunt of it, often losing significant income. In Canada, however, farmers are guaranteed a minimum price for their milk, ensuring that they aren't left to fend for themselves during price downturns. This support system has helped stabilize the Canadian dairy industry and allowed small farms to survive. In the U.S., small farmers have been left to weather the storm alone. This difference in approach, Canada's stable and ethical farming practices versus the U.S.'s reliance on free market forces, has made a world of difference. For Mexico, choosing Canada as a partner was about more than just securing a reliable milk supply. It was about aligning with a country that shared their values of transparency, ethical farming, and environmental responsibility. And while the U.S. dairy industry continues to face an uncertain future, Canada has positioned itself as the go-to source for consumers who want to know where their milk comes from and how it was produced. The long-term impact: a changing landscape for American agriculture. The shift in Mexico's dairy imports is more than just a market trend. It marks a deeper transformation in the way the world is beginning to think about food production. The days when cheap and fast food commodities dominated the global market are waning. In their place, transparency, ethics, and sustainability have become the new currency in international trade. For the United States, this shift presents a challenge, one that extends far beyond dairy and into the heart of American agriculture itself. America's agricultural power has long been defined by its ability to produce massive quantities of food at competitive prices. In the case of dairy, this meant giant industrial farms in states like California, Wisconsin, and Idaho, where the focus was on speed, output, and scale. Milk production became akin to a factory assembly line. automated, highly efficient, but impersonal. This model, which has served the U.S. well for decades, is now coming under scrutiny. Consumers, particularly younger generations, are no longer simply interested in a cheap product. They want to know the story behind it. How was it produced? Who was involved in making it? What values does it represent? In contrast, Canada's dairy industry has focused on a different set of values: ethics, transparency, and sustainability. While Canada's milk may not be as cheap or abundant as its American counterpart, it comes with a guarantee, one that has resonated deeply with consumers, especially in markets like Mexico. Canada's dairy farmers are part of a system that guarantees a minimum price for their milk, a system that provides stability even when market conditions are unfavorable. This approach has allowed small family farms to thrive, offering a level of security and sustainability that the U.S. system, dominated by large corporate farms, has been unable to provide. The contrast between the U.S. and Canada becomes even more pronounced when considering how each country views its farmers. In the U.S., dairy farmers are often seen as the final link in a long, impersonal supply chain, forced to bear the brunt of market fluctuations. They are vulnerable to price drops and global market shifts, and many small farms have gone out of business as a result. On the other hand, Canada views its farmers as partners in a larger agricultural ecosystem. The government supports the industry through production quotas, ensuring that supply doesn't exceed demand and that farmers are paid fairly for their work. This approach has fostered a sense of stability and trust within the Canadian dairy industry, something that is increasingly appealing to consumers. This model of ethical farming and transparency has made Canada a leader in global dairy trade, particularly in markets where consumers are becoming more discerning about the origins of their food. According to a 2024 survey by Gallup, 68% of young consumers in Europe and North America are willing to pay an additional 15 to 30% for products with ethical and sustainable certifications. This trend is particularly evident in Mexico, where consumers are increasingly prioritizing quality over price. By choosing Canada, they are not just opting for a different supplier, they are choosing a system that aligns with their values. The broader implications of this shift extend far beyond the dairy industry. The way we think about food production, sustainability, and ethics is evolving, and the U.S. agricultural system must adapt if it wants to remain competitive on the global stage. If the U.S. continues to focus solely on price and scale, it risks losing more markets like Mexico, and not just in dairy but across the entire agricultural sector. As demand for ethically produced food grows, countries that can deliver on these values will be the ones that succeed. This is where Canada has already started to establish a strong foothold. The United States still has time to change its course. By embracing sustainability, focusing on ethical production, and investing in transparency, the U.S. can reclaim some of the trust it has lost. But the window for this change is closing. As Mexico's decision to turn to Canada demonstrates, the world is no longer asking how much you can produce, but how you produce it. If the U.S. dairy industry fails to adjust, it may lose more than just market share. It could lose its place in a rapidly changing global food system. For now, Canada remains quietly confident, securing lucrative contracts and continuing to build its reputation as a trusted partner. With the 7-year, $3.2 billion deal with Mexico in hand, Canada's dairy industry is well positioned for the future. Meanwhile, in the U.S., small farmers continue to struggle, and large corporate farms dominate the landscape, focusing on quantity over quality. As the market evolves, the question remains, will the U.S. continue to race toward production, or will it learn to slow down, embrace sustainability, and regain the trust it has lost? Ultimately, the world still needs milk. But in this new era, the world needs more than just quantity, it needs a story. And that story, it seems, is being written not in the fields of Wisconsin or California, but in the small, ethical farms of Canada.